For those of you who read the abstract for the presentation tonight, you know I'm talking about the type of pulses that we eat, not the pulses related to the beating of our hearts. Although there may be a relationship between the two, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But before doing that, I'd like to say special thanks to Okanagan College and to John for providing me the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you very much. So the food we eat is important. And the decision we make every day about what to eat and what not to eat has significant impacts on the outcomes of our health, as well as the health of the environment. And last year, the United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, declared 2016 as the International Year of Pulses. And there are a number of reasons for that. Primarily, it is because of increasing awareness of the health benefits of pulses as well as the environmental benefits of pulses. So I have listed here the 3 objectives for the International Year of Pulses. The first objective is to raise awareness about the important role of pulses in sustainable food production, their role in healthy diets, as well as their contribution to food security and nutrition. The second objective is to promote the value and utilization of pulses throughout the entire food chain, their benefits for soil fertility as well as climate change, and the role they play in combating malnutrition. And then finally, looking at the connections along the entire food chain to further global production of pulses, to increase the use of pulses as part of crop rotations, and to also conduct more research to understand the composition of pulses, the benefits of pulses for human health and the environment, and basically to address the challenges associated with the trade of pulses. Now, we celebrated the year. There were several different countries that participated in many different events, and I have here a few pictures of people around the globe that contributed different celebrations throughout the year to the success of the year. It was a tremendous success with over 3 billion social media hits, and so we were able to achieve the objectives that were set in terms of awareness, and we still need to do a lot more work. The organizers of the International Year of Pulses set some ambitious targets. So the hope is that by 2020, we would increase the production of pulses by 10%, and also increase the consumption of pulses by 10%. In Canada, the pulse sector has set an even more ambitious target, 25 by 2025. And the hope is that by 2025, about 25% of the production capacity in Canada will be used in the development of new food products and non-food products as well. So it's an ambitious target. So although we have attained the objectives, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to get us to producing more pulses, consuming more pulses. The awareness is occurring, but we need to do a lot more work. So I'm glad to have the opportunity today to talk to you about pulses. And what I'm hoping to do is to answer 3 basic questions today. The first question is, what are pulses? As I said, there's a bit of confusion sometimes when you use the word pulses. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then secondly, why are they important for human health and for the environment? And how can we diversify our diets with pulses? It's one thing to know that pulses are good for the health and for the environment, but how do we actually consume more pulses? So starting with the first question, what are pulses? So I have here some pictures of pulses. Pulses are the dried seeds of legumes, and specifically, they are the low-fat containing legumes, such as lentils, beans, peas, chickpeas, and lupins. And I'm sure that you have all seen these products in the supermarket. So just to make a difference between legumes and pulses, all pulses are legumes, but not all legumes are pulses. So here I have a list of some of the legumes that we're used to seeing in the supermarket. Soybean and peanut, pea, chickpea, lentil, beans, and lupins. They all belong to the family Fabaceae, or leguminosae, so they're all legumes. But soybeans and peanuts are considered as oil seeds. Soybean contains anywhere from 17 to 23% fat, and peanut contains up to 50% fat. So they're used primarily as a source of oil, so they're called oil seeds. And peas, chickpeas, lentils, beans, and lupins are low-fat legumes. And so they're grain legumes that are called pulses. So when we talk about pulses, we're specifically referring to the low-fat containing legumes, peas, chickpeas, lentils, beans, and lupins. Pulses are grown in practically every continent on the globe. And I have shown here some of the major producing countries. And one of the things that comes as a surprise to many people is that Canada is a major player when we talk about the production of pulses. A lot of people don't think that Canada produces pulses, but we actually do. And in fact, we play an important role in the production of pulses. So when you look at pulse production globally, we are number 2 in global ranking, next to India. India is the major producer of pulses and the major consumer of pulses. And Canada is the 2nd largest producer of pulses globally. But it gets even better. We are the number 1 in terms of trade, pulse trade, global ranking. So we are the major exporter of pulses, 35% of the global share, and that's significant. In Canada, pulses are grown primarily in the prairies. So in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, with Saskatchewan being the primary province where pulses are grown. We also grow pulses in Ontario and Quebec, and it's primarily beans. So I have another slide here that shows you more details. So if you look in the prairie region, the green is pea, the yellow is lentil, the gray is chickpea, and the red is beans. So the majority of pulses are grown in the prairie region, and Quebec and Ontario have some bean production. But we don't grow a lot of beans. Like if you look at the amounts of pulses that we produce, it's primarily peas and lentils. We produce some chickpeas and some beans as well, and the beans are primarily in Ontario and Quebec. Now, the story of pulses in Canada is a success story, from humble beginnings to a global leader. In 1981, we were barely growing pulses in Canada, under 250,000 hectares. And in 2011, over 2 million hectares of pulses are grown in Canada. And it has continued to increase in the intervening years. So it's a tremendous amount of increase. And the pulse sector has been a global leader in doing research to understand the properties of pulses, the benefits of pulses for health, as well as for the environment. And so I'm going to move on now to talk to you about why pulses are important for human health and the environment. And I'll start off with the health benefits. And start off with the recommendations for eating well in Canada. And so Health Canada provides guidance for us in terms of our food choices with a food guide. And I recommend that you take a look at the food guide. It gives us recommendations for different age groups. And in addition to the food guide, when you go to the website, you would find this. Eat these foods more often. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lower fat milk, fish, lean meat, and meat alternatives. And here they provide specific examples. And we find here beans, lentils, and tofu. Tofu is mostly made from soybeans. And beans and lentils, as I said, are pulses. They're all legumes, but I'm talking primarily about pulses today. So beans and lentils are meat alternatives, and that's because their protein content is similar to most of the meats that we consume. In addition to this, Health Canada also recommends that you choose products that contain less fat, saturated fat, less saturated fat, less trans fat, less sugar, and sodium. And it's important that when you're buying foods that you look at the ingredient list to ensure that you're selecting foods that are low in fat, low in sugar, and low in sodium. And they recommend that we select products that are high in fiber. And that's because research suggests that in having a diet that is higher in fiber is good for the health. So the question is, how do we do that? So how are these recommendations aligned to the composition of pulses? So I have here a list of some of the properties of pulses related to their composition. Pulses are high in protein. They contain anywhere from 18 to 25% protein, and that's about the range that you will have if you're looking at meat. Meats contain about 20% protein, so they're high in protein, and they can serve as a meat alternative. They're also high in fiber. The recommendation of Pulse Canada is to consume foods that are high in fiber. And pulses are high in fiber. They're high in carbohydrate, but the majority of the carbohydrates that you would find in pulses are the good types of carbohydrates. Resistant starch, they digest more slowly, and we need that kind of a starch. And they're high in fiber, soluble fiber, and insoluble fiber. They're also low in fat. I just talked about the difference between the high fat containing legumes and the low fat legumes. So pulses are low in fat. They are high in micronutrients like folate and vitamins, high in minerals, potassium, and iron. And over and above these nutritional benefits, they also provide health benefits. There are a number of non-communicable diseases that are of increasing concern in many developed countries, and I have listed some of them here. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and cancer. And we know that many of these diseases are linked to the diet. And pulses may play a role in decreasing the risks associated with these diseases. And the question is, how do they do that? So I like this slide because it provides a comparison between the composition of pulses and some of the flours and foods that we consume regularly. We have common flours that are made here at the bottom: potato, rice, corn, and all-purpose wheat and whole wheat. And on top, we have some of the pulse flours: dry pea, lentil, chickpea. And when you look at it from the left to the right, looking at protein, low fat, high fiber, potassium, folate, and iron, and you would see that for the most part, the pulses have check marks there, except for chickpea. Chickpea contains about 6 to 7% fat, and most of the other pulses are about 2% fat. So that's why there's no check mark there for fat. But when you compare that to the products we have at the bottom, you can see that nutritionally, pulses are much higher quality than the products that I have at the bottom there. The other thing I want to talk about is an index that helps us to assess the quality of foods, the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index gives us an indication of the rate at which sugar is released into the blood. And so for those who are concerned about the sugar levels in the blood or diabetes, you're looking for foods that have low glycemic index. When you have a food that has a high glycemic index, it means that it releases sugar much faster into the blood. And the pulses on top there are all lower than 55. And as I have shown here, carbohydrates with low GI values under 55 release sugar slowly into the blood. And so they help with those who are concerned with high blood sugar levels and insulin as well. There are a number of research studies that has been conducted on the relationship between pulse consumption and a number of diseases. And I'm going to just share a few of them with you. Now, this particular paper is a review. It's a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis looks at the body of evidence available, looks at several publications, and does a review and teases out a consensus from the documents, the publications that are available. So this is a paper that reviewed several publications on the effect of non-oil seed, so pulses, the low-fat pulses, on glycemic control. And the conclusion of this study is that pulses alone, or in low GI or high-fiber diets, improve markers of long-term glycemic control in humans. So I was talking about glycemic index, sugar levels, diabetes. And this study, a meta-analysis, shows that consuming pulses as part of a low GI or high-fiber diet does improve the markers associated with glycemic control. This is another study, another meta-analysis, and this time it was looking at dietary pulses and satiety and food intake. So we're talking here about obesity, which is related to caloric intake, and satiety, the feeling of fullness we have when we consume food. And what they found is that dietary pulses contribute to acute satiety. And so at a sitting, when you have pulses as part of your meal, the presence of the pulse makes you feel full faster, which helps to decrease the amount of food that you take, and in so doing, it decreases the caloric intake, and it can have an impact on obesity and weight gain. In this particular review, they found that there was no effect of the second meal intake, because sometimes, in some instances, there were papers that reported that the effect actually can be felt at the second meal intake. So say, for example, you have a food in the morning and you have pulses in them. The next time you eat, you still have that residual effect of the satiety. So this one found that at a sitting, when you eat and you have pulses as part of your diet, it does help to decrease the amount of calorie you take in because of the satiety, the impact it has on satiety, but not on second meal intake. This paper was published recently in December. And here they looked at a low plant-based burger made from pulses and a high plant-based protein pulses used to make the burgers, a low concentration and a high concentration. And they compared it to burgers made with meat. And they found that a plant-based burger made from pulses beats meat for satiety. And their conclusion was that this is primarily due to the fiber and not the protein. Now, the people who did this, who were part of the study, were not used to consuming pulses or high amounts of pulses. And so you would note at the bottom that the high protein level may be difficult to obtain solely from vegetable sources without compromising palatability. They were not used to consuming the pulses. But the interesting observation here is that they found that the low protein meal based on legumes was rated as being both as satiating and as palatable as the high protein meat-based meal. So you don't have to eat a whole lot to get the effect. You can eat a little bit and still get that effect of satiety, which helps to decrease caloric intake. This other study looked at metabolic syndrome risk factors. And when you talk about metabolic syndrome risk factors, these are risks associated with things like stroke and diabetes and cardiovascular disease risk. And so they use things like waist circumference, cholesterol levels, blood sugar levels to determine the risk of metabolic syndrome. And they found in their conclusion that frequent consumption of pulses in an ad libitum diet reduced the risk factors of the metabolic syndrome. And these effects were equivalent and in some instances stronger than counseling for dietary energy reduction. And finally, this other study that looked at pulse grain consumption and obesity. And they also concluded that given the available evidence, it can be concluded that pulses could be useful as functional foods and food ingredients that combat obesity. So the results are quite compelling for satiety, for diabetes, for caloric intake. I want to briefly talk about cardiovascular disease risk because it's another major problem. And the economic burden of cardiovascular disease is high. As you can see here, 2010, $863 billion globally. By 2030, $1,044 billion. So there are significant socioeconomic impacts of cardiovascular disease risks. And there's research that has been done on the potential impact of pulses on decreasing risk associated with cardiovascular disease. And this one looks specifically at cholesterol levels. Non-soy legume consumption lowers cholesterol levels, and in their conclusion, they indicate that a diet rich in legumes other than soy decreases total and LDL cholesterol. There is a health claim for soy, so this paper focused primarily on the pulses, the non-fat containing legumes. And they found a similar effect. Now, as part of my research, we have looked at potential mechanisms for this cholesterol lowering effect. And one of the things we looked at was the possibility of bile acid binding. Now, what happens when we eat foods that are high in fats is that the body produces bile to help us to digest the fats. And we take cholesterol in the liver. It's synthesized into the bile, which is then injected into the gastrointestinal tract to help with the digestion. So if you have a sequestrant that binds the bile and helps to eliminate the bile, there'll be more cholesterol taken from the blood, synthesized into bile, and then injected into the gastrointestinal tract to help in the digestion. So the more cholesterol that is used, that is synthesized into bile, the lower the amount of circulating cholesterol that you would have in the blood. So that's one of the mechanisms by which cholesterol levels could be decreased in the blood. And so what we did was to look at the bile acid binding capacity of some pulse products as a potential mechanism for explaining the cholesterol reduction. I wouldn't show you too many figures, but this is one of the few that I'm going to be showing you. And here, what we did was we looked at different bile acids. This one is a particular bile acid, sodium cholate. And we looked at cholestyramine, which is a sequestrant, as a reference. And we compared different pulses, pulse flours and concentrates and hydrolysates with this reference standard. And as you can see, the products that we looked at were either higher or close to the reference, which showed that they actually have bile acid binding property. And so bile acid binding may be one of the mechanisms by which cholesterol is lowered in the blood. The other thing I want to talk about is gut health. There's a significant amount of research that is going on today that suggests that the microorganisms that we have in our body can contribute to health and having a good immune system. And I'm talking about the good microorganisms, what we call probiotics. Probiotics are the good microorganisms. And you need to feed these good microorganisms with a type of food that the microorganisms need. And that type of food is called a prebiotic. And they're kinds of starches and fibers that these microorganisms need to survive. I have here pictures that show a starch granule, kind of a fiber, a high amylose starch granule. After it has gone through the gastrointestinal tract of a human, a pig, and in the last picture, you can see the bifidobacteria attached to the starch. You need to feed the body with these kinds of starches because that's what the good microorganisms need. And pulses have a lot of these healthy carbohydrates that the good microorganisms need in the diet. And one of our research scientists at Guelph is doing work on this, looking at gut health and pulses. And the data that she is generating suggests that pulses may improve gut health because of this ability to act as a prebiotic to support the growth of the good microorganisms. I want to move on now to talk a little bit about protein quality. Pulses are used as a meat alternative because they're high in protein. And they're different sources of protein. Most animal sources of protein are high quality because they're similar to the proteins that we have as humans. But if you're looking for a balance in your diet, then you want sources of protein not just from animals, but from plants as well. And when you're taking your protein from plants, you need to ensure that you have a good balance of proteins and a high quality of those proteins. So here I'm going to be talking about protein quality, and I'll just explain something about protein quality. When you consume a protein, your body, we have enzymes that break these proteins into what we call amino acids. And then your body goes in and takes from these amino acids and uses them as building blocks to build your muscles and your blood and the enzymes that you need. So think of it as you're playing Scrabble and you want to form the letters, say, health, which is H-E-L-T-H. You need the letters, the alphabets, H-E-A-L-T-H. If you had H-E-A-L-P, you cannot form the word health. You actually need to have the letters H-E-A-L-T-H. So amino acids are the letters for the proteins. We eat the food and the enzymes break the word down into the letters. And then your body wants to form something and it picks the alphabets and then decides what it wants to form, a muscle protein or an enzyme. So the amino acid is important, and the digestibility. The ability for the enzyme to get into the protein and chop it up into the alphabets is important because that's when your body can then go in and pick the letters it needs to form whatever muscles that you're looking for. So the amino acid is important, the digestibility is important, and we put the two together, we get what we call the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. It's a long word. I'll just call it PDCAS. And in general, when you have a PDCAS value of 1, what it means is that the protein can be easily broken down into the letters and that you have the right type of letters to form the different proteins that the body needs.
So if you look at the bottom there, casein has a value of 1. It's an animal-based protein. Beef will have a value of 1. Eggs will have a value of 1. But when you talk about plant proteins, plants they're not the same as animal proteins. And so it becomes important that you combine different foods in order to get the quality of protein, to get the mixture of alphabets that you need to allow your body to form the kinds of proteins that it needs. So I'll show you, for example, the PDCAAS for wheat flour. It's 0.43. So if you have a slice of bread, toast in the morning with a cup of coffee, the quality of the protein you have in your bread is low. You don't have all of the amino acids. You don't have all the letters you need to form the different proteins your body needs. Now, if you take something like lentil alone by itself, you have 0.63. It's better than wheat, but not as high as you would want it. You want something that comes as close to 1. Now, see what happens when you combine lentil and wheat. You get to 0.71. It's higher than either the wheat alone or the lentil alone. And it's all about complementation. It's about sharing the plate. It's about mixing corn and pulses, rice and pulses, wheat and pulses. Because as you can see here, by blending, you generally increase the quality of the diet. I want to move on now to talk very briefly about food allergies, because that's another area that is important. We have an increasing incidence of food allergies. In general, about 2 to 4% of the population, adult population, suffer from food allergies, and about 4 to 6% of children suffer from food allergies. I have here 8 of the major food allergens. In Canada, we would include sesame and mustard as well. In Europe, so here we have soy. Soy is a legume, but in Canada, we don't have any of the pulses as a major allergen. In Europe, they have other major allergens, and lupin is one of them. Lupin is a pulse, and it's the only one that they have in Europe. But in Canada, pulses have not been determined to be a priority allergen. Now, food allergy can be debilitating, and I show here what some of the symptoms are like. It affects children as well as adults. This can happen not just outside, but internally as well. And the redness you see in the mouth can happen all along the gastrointestinal tract, and it can cause all kinds of problems for people who have food allergies. This is what celiac disease looks like in the gastrointestinal tract. And what happens is this atrophy of the villi in the gastrointestinal tract for people who do not know that they have celiac disease. When you continue to consume foods that you should not eat, you get this atrophy, and then they can't absorb nutrients, and it can cause all kinds of diseases ultimately. So it's a big problem, and people need to avoid that. So the foods to avoid if you have celiac disease are gluten-containing cereals: wheat, barley, rice, spelt, kamut. And it is important that you find alternatives. So for those who have food allergies or who have intolerance to gluten, they need to find alternatives. And the good thing about pulses is that they're gluten-free, wheat-free, soy-free, and peanut-free. So for those who have food allergies and who are looking for healthy alternatives in their diet, pulses can provide them with those alternatives. I'd like to quickly move on to talk about the environmental benefits. The health benefits is one thing, but the environmental benefit is equally important, is the sustainability of the planet. And pulses, again, do amazing things when we look at the environmental benefits. The first important thing is the ability to fix nitrogen in the soil. We've been talking a lot about climate change lately. It's the content of nitrogen and carbon that we have in the environment. And to be able to capture that nitrogen and that carbon in the soil is a target for many of the scientists who are working on climate change. Pulses are interesting because they are able to take that nitrogen from the air and capture it in the soil. They have nodules in their root system that work with microorganisms in the soil to capture that nitrogen and trap it in the soil. And because they do that, there is less requirement for fertilizer when you're producing pulses. And not just for the pulse production, but for the subsequent crop that is produced, because they leave the nitrogen in the soil so that for the subsequent crop, you don't have to use as much fertilizer as you would use. And because you're using less fertilizer, there is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with the use of these fertilizers. They also improve soil health. They have a low carbon footprint, generally when you look at the overall production system. And they are also drought tolerant, which means that you don't need as much water when you're producing pulses. And when you put all of these together, you can see why the indigenous cultures, age-old wisdom, they were doing this many, many years ago. They practiced what they call Three Sisters agriculture, where you have corn, beans, and squash grown together. The beans and the squash complement each other in terms of the protein quality, and the squash provides them with the micronutrients. So you get the nutrient for the soil, you get the benefit for the soil, as well as when you cook, you have the complement of nutrients that you need in the diet. And this wisdom, I think, is becoming broader knowledge. And as we do research to understand how best to include pulses as part of crop rotation systems. In Canada, I have an example here of what a crop rotation system looks like. An oil seed, followed by a cereal, and a pulse, and a cereal. So once in 4 rotations, you would have a pulse introduced there. And this is a schematic of what crop rotation versus a monoculture wheat would look like. Pulses provide opportunities for microbial life to flourish. It helps to break diseases, weed, and insect cycles, and it increases the microbial diversity. And this is because, as I said, you have the nodules in the root system that work with the microorganisms to improve the quality of the soils. This is another figure, and I'm not going to go into details here. This is CO2 emissions, looking at different foods. And on the extreme left, you have lamb and beef, and then as you move towards the right, you have lentils and dry beans, and you can see that the CO2 emissions are a lot lower compared to the foods on the left. This is another slide on water footprint, the amount of water that it takes to produce pulses compared to the amount of water it takes to produce beef. 43 gallons to produce 1 pound of pulses, and 1,857 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. So you can see that there's a huge difference there in terms of the drought tolerance of pulses. So low carbon footprint and low water footprint. Now I want to show you this slide, which is quite interesting. This is a slide on soil organic carbon change in Canadian soils. And we're looking at, it's an indication of soil health. As I said, we want to capture the carbon in the soil. We want to increase the carbon content in the soil. So I'm going to draw your attention to the band at the bottom there. When you have yellow, there's no change. Now, as you move to the left, lighter green, moderate increase, so you're improving the quality of the soil. Darker green, even better quality of the soil. And when you go towards the right, orange, you're having decreases. So you're decreasing the quality of the soil. And red, even larger decreases in the quality of the soil. So now, that's 1981. This is what the picture is for Canada. 1986, and I'd like you to pay attention to the prairie region there. So it was yellow before, again, 1981. 1986, you're seeing more light green. 1991, you're starting to see some darker green. 1996, more darker green. 2001, 2006, 2011. And then now I'm going to go back quickly, and I'll draw your attention to the Ontario-Quebec region. And pay attention as we move from 1981 to 1986, 1991, 1996, you're starting to see more red, 2001, 2006, 2011. So the quality of the soils is increasing in the prairies, and something is happening in Ontario and Quebec. And I'm going to go back to this slide I showed you earlier. Where do we grow pulses? In the prairies. And the prairies are grown primarily Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. And in the same period of time I just showed you, from 1981 to 2011, we have seen an increase in pulse production. And so the increase in pulse production, because it's replacing the summer fallow, is contributing to the improvement in the quality of the soils in the prairie region. And also, they're not using tilling. They're practicing no-till in the prairie regions, which is good for the health. So they're capturing more organic carbon in the soil. And we need to look at what is happening in Ontario and the Quebec region to see how we can improve the quality of the soils. But we have a good approach that has been used in the prairies that could potentially be applied to other regions in Canada. And this is interesting because it shows the potential of the right agricultural practices and ensuring the sustainability of our soils. And the good news about pulses is that it doesn't just provide us with an improvement in our human health, it's also good for the health of the environment. And that really is the story about pulses, the ability to improve human health without compromising the health of the environment. So now I want to move on quickly to talk about how we can diversify our diet with pulses. We know that pulses are good for health, they're good for the environment, and now we need to figure out a way to increase our consumption of pulses. So how do we do that? I started the presentation with this slide, factors that influence consumer food choice. There are a number of factors. So sensory appeal is probably one of the most important ones. No matter how good a food is for the health and for the environment, if it doesn't taste good, if it doesn't look good, we're not going to eat it. So sensory appeal is important. But nutrition and health are important. Economic factors, affordability, important. Social factors, what your friends are eating, what media is telling you about those foods. Emotional factors, and so for example, we have turkey for Christmas and for Thanksgiving, there's an emotional connection there, or what we grow up eating, we like that, and we stick to it. Environmental factors are increasingly important. Consumers are interested in the kinds of practices that we use to produce our foods. We just talked about nutrition and health, so I'll give a check mark for that, for pulses. Economic factors, because pulses are very affordable, probably one of the cheapest sources of protein out there. Social factors, we just had a successful 2016, over 3 billion hits, as I talked about. People are starting to be aware of the benefits of pulses for health and for the environment. Emotional factors, perhaps a smaller check, but the people who grew up in India, for example, grew up consuming pulses, there's that emotional connection there. In Europe, there's some people who consume pulses for New Year's, for example. It's associated with prosperity. And in even southern parts of the United States. So there is something there. But I suppose we could do some more work there. And environmental factors gets a big check mark. We just talked about that. So then the main challenge is sensory appeal. We need to have pulses in a way that makes us want to consume pulses. And I'll talk a little bit about that in these last few minutes. So color, texture, and taste are important when we talk about sensory appeal. And the good thing about pulses is that they provide tremendous color to foods. And so I have here examples of different pulses, all the way from almost pitch black to white and different colors in between. And we can get them as whole pulses and as flowers that increases the kinds of products that we can make from them. We have evolved as humans to be attracted to color because colorful foods are actually good for us. And so if you look at the fruits that I have here, they're colorful. The color are the phytochemicals that we need for health. The difference between humans and animals is that animals can move. And because they can move, they're able to move away from threats, and they don't have a need to produce chemicals to address threats. And that's why we need to take medication. Human beings have to take medication because we don't produce these phytochemicals. Plants, on the other hand, cannot move. They're stationary. And so they need to develop defense mechanisms. And they do that by producing these phytochemicals that helps them to address threats. And these phytochemicals are what we find in these colorful components in foods, both in fruits as well as in vegetables. And so the color is critical, and we have that as well in pulses, the many different varieties of pulses that we find on the market. And you can cook pulses at home and add them to salads to give you a splash of color. And you know that by adding the color to your food, you're adding nutrition to the diet. A lot of people think it takes a long time to cook pulses, but it really doesn't. If you take something like lentils, in 15 minutes, you can cook lentils or split peas. That's about the same amount of time it takes to cook rice. So Yes, for chickpeas and perhaps beans, you need to soak them and cook them for a long time, but there are pulses that can be cooked very quickly. And if you can't cook them, you can buy them canned and use them. They add wonderful color to the diet. To facilitate cooking, pulses are also processed, splits and dehulled. That expands the ways in which we can use them because they cook much faster. Today we have technologies that allow us to split the pulses into the flours, the fibers, the starches, and the proteins, and it gives us greater flexibility in terms of the manufacturing of foods. For food convenience, we don't always cook at home, and so having these ingredients allows us to expand the kinds of products that we can make from food, the value-added food products. So I'd just like to quickly go through some of the products that are available on the market now. Some of them you could make at home, but others as just for convenience. Baked beans, I think, is one of the easiest ways in which one can include pulses in their diet. And of course, when you're buying these canned foods, as recommended by Health Canada, make sure you're looking at the salt content, the sugar content, and picking those for brands that provide you with lower salt content and the lower sugar content. But the important thing is to find ways to include the pulses in the diet. Soups are another way to include pulses in the diet, and again, they come in different forms. And so these are canned: lentil and red pepper soup, cod and lentil, split pea and hum. The packaging varies, and even I find the names they are giving to these different products, Soupology and Glorious, Kinalicious, and it's alluding to the impact on reducing, obesity for weight management. But they're just finding packaging that will make these products more attractive to us as consumers. Dips are another easy way to include pulses in the diet, and hummus is something that we can easily get today. Very flavorful, very tasty, made with chickpeas. You can have the traditional hummus, and on top you have a variety that has spinach and artichoke, for example. And what's interesting is that lentils are also being used to make hummus, so you can have diversity, not just from chickpeas, but from lentils as well. This is made with organic red lentils, and they're promoting it as sourced from local producers whenever possible. Miso is a product that is made from soybeans for adding some flavor to the food. And if for one reason or the other you don't want to use soybeans, there's miso that is made with chickpea. Bread. You can add pulse flours to bread to get this rich, dense texture. And again, as I said, the darker the food is, the more phytonutrients you have in the food. And so you can make this at home by buying pulse flours and including them in your mixes. We made some research experiments on different proteins from pulses. And as you can see here, we have lentil, pea, and chickpea. And in fact, in addition to the nutrient, increasing the nutrient content, we found that chickpea protein, for example, helps to increase the volume of the bread. So there are other functional benefits you can get as well. And the color of the breads can change. And so the more you add, you get different types of colors. And it just provides functionality and flexibility for manufacturing. Now, if you don't want to buy the bread and you want to contribute to the making of this, there are flours available today that contain pulses. These flours contain garbanzo bean flour, fava bean flour, and you just have to mix it with a few ingredients and bake it at home, and so you'll be part of the bread making process, and you have pulses. But you can also buy the bread already made, and this just came out. It's a Canadian rustic bean bread made with chickpeas, beans, lentils, and peas that's available on the market. This one labeled as gluten-free, containing chickpea flour, and it's a flax loaf. And you can see here the different types. Red lentil, green lentil, black bean. It just gives richness to the plate in terms of the color of the dishes that can be made with these different products. This one is made from chickpea, and it's promoted as containing twice as much protein as the regular pasta. This one is blended lentil and quinoa. I talked earlier about blending proteins to improve the quality, and they've done it cleverly here by mixing lentil and quinoa to improve the protein quality. This is a meat alternative made with lentil flour and dried lentils, as well as other ingredients. Another meat alternative, including pea fiber. So this is one case where you can take the fiber and add it into a product to increase the fiber content. Snacks, healthy snacking, chickpeas, lentils, and beans. And yes, chips, because they're using healthier ingredients here. Plentils, I love the play on words here. And this is made with lentil powder. And again, it's being promoted as gluten-free, 40% less fat, free from the 8 common allergens, and high protein. This is a cereal containing soy protein and pea fiber, increasing the fiber content of the diet. This is a snack containing pea starch, pea protein, and pea fiber in different ratios. So now you have the flexibility as a manufacturer to take the components that you want and put them back in different ratios. This is a liquid nutrition containing pea fiber. It's a way to increase the fiber content, and this is one for kids, again with pea fiber. Even in the beverage category, the protein content of almond milk can be increased by adding, in this case, pea protein. And by doing that, you have 5 times the protein content as a regular almond milk. And you could also get this pea protein as a powder. It's labeled as gluten-free, lactose-free, soy-free, cholesterol-free, diabetic-friendly, source of beneficial amino acid, and hypoallergenic. And they provide here some suggestions on how you can make smoothies with these protein shakes. Ice cream. I guess we all have weaknesses, and although we would like to eat healthy, it is possible to get ice cream that is made with pulses. This is made with lupin. It's a product made in Germany. From lupins, as I said. And on the websites, you would find a number of ice cream products that are made with pulses. This is made with cooked red lentils here, and black beluga lentils here. So there are a number of things that we can make with pulses and pulse ingredients. Now, one of the interesting things I found last year as we celebrated the International Year of Pulses is Aquafaba. Now, when you open a can of chickpeas, the liquid that you throw away apparently could serve as an egg replacer. When you whip it for about 10 minutes or so, it forms a foam that is fairly stable. And you can use that as a topping for those who have allergies to eggs, for example. You could bake it to form a meringue, and there are suggestions here on how you could serve them, which I found to be very interesting. So I think I can give a check mark for sensory appeal for pulses. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think that we're getting there. And my hope is that we will be able to continue to do work that will improve the sensory quality of pulses to enhance its appeal to consumers. But I'd like to conclude on a more serious note. And this is about global population and our capacity to feed humans on the planet that we share. When we talk about food security, many developed countries, for the most part, have food security. Although we continue to have pockets of food insecurity. In Canada, for example, we do have pockets of food insecurity. But in many emerging economies and many developing countries, food insecurity continues to be a big problem. We need to figure out ways to produce enough food to feed everyone on the planet. Today, as I speak, there are 800 million people who are hungry on this planet. And that's a lot. 800 million people, that's equivalent to the entire population of Europe that is hungry as we speak. And that is significant. By 2030, the population of the globe is going to move from 7.5 billion to about 8.6 billion. We're going to be adding 1 billion more people between now and 2030. That's 13 years from now. And that is equivalent to the entire population of North and South America in the next 13 years. That will be adding over and above the 800 million people that are hungry. By 2050, the population of the globe is projected to reach 9.6, 9.7 billion. That's adding 2 times the population of North and South America to the current population. And you lay on top of that climate variability and the uncertainties around that, and the impacts of that on agricultural production. And in many ways, producing enough nutritious food sustainably to feed the global population may very well become the most important challenge that we face in the coming years. And this is where pulses come in. I showed you this slide earlier. It's the ability to produce food that is good for our health without compromising the health of the environment. As part of the celebrations of 2016, we developed this acrostic, Agriculture and Agri-food Canada. I worked with the public affairs branch to develop this acrostic to help in promoting the benefits of pulses using the very letters P-U-L-S-E-S. And I think this is a very good summary for this presentation. So P stands for protein. Pulses are an excellent source of protein. When combined with different sources of protein, it helps to provide us with healthy, nutritious protein in the diet. U is for use, diversity. Pulses come in all colors and shapes and sizes. They're grown in many different parts of the world, and we can use them in many interesting ways to diversify our diet. L is for living well, healthy living. Just adding half a cup of pulse to your diet improves the nutritional quality of the diet. The first S is for sustainable. When we include pulses in crop rotation, they improve the nutritional quality of the soil. E is for the environment. Pulses are good for the environment. They have a low carbon footprint and a low water footprint. And the final S is for security. Pulses are dried seeds. You can store them for a long time, decreasing food waste and helping to ensure food security for the planet. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions.